get to our next topic. This isn't it. Let's just cut to the chase. We talk about America being a world economic power, and so it amazes me how folks will say, "Oh no, it was the Industrial Revolution that turned America into an economic power." No, it was slavery. It was free labor. It was what black folks did, people of African descent, that made America be the capitalistic society it is. There's a new book out that is a phenomenal book. And of course, remember, we talked about the book Empire of Cotton, A Global History on this show. This is another book that I think you must read. It's called The Have Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism by Edward E. Baptist. Glad to have you here, Edward. This is a phenomenal read. And I think too many Americans are living in denial when they say, "Nah, man, I got you," but no, our economic system, those 13 colonies, was based upon slavery. The North benefited, the South benefited, and that's what positioned us for economic greatness.
Yeah, I think so. And the story you allude to, or the fact that you allude to, is that there are kind of two accounts of it. One is an account that has been known by African Americans. In fact, I remember getting some pieces of this from my very first teachers in Durham, North Carolina, who were black. But on the other hand, the white narrative of this has been much more focused on the Industrial Revolution. That's the source of economic
railroads
innovation,
and oil and Rockefeller and Vanderbilt.
Right. But of course, we know cotton was, in effect, the oil of the early 19th century economic boom that the U.S. experienced. It was 50% of all our exports. It was responsible for a huge amount of our economic activity. But what we traditionally thought was this was just sort of basic hand labor. It wasn't made as efficiently by slaves as free people could have made it. But what in fact we now know is that enslaved people made cotton more efficiently every single year. And they made it not by choice. They made it more efficiently, not by choice, but because they were forced to do so by a system of torture.
And in fact, it wasn't just the question of slaves. Even after slavery ended, you had those planters who desperately needed that labor. And so even after 1865, the conditions of former slaves, you talk about those sharecroppers, it was just as bad, simply the chains were removed.
Right. It was almost as bad. I think enslaved people have less choice about the conditions under which they work. I think that's pretty clear. But on the other hand, cotton continued to be tremendously important. In fact, the federal government, essentially conspired with former slave owners to keep formerly enslaved people on the plantation, as it were, making cotton rather than being independent farmers or going into industry or going into business for themselves.
I asked this question of all authors. Was there one thing during the research for this book where you went, wow?
There were a lot of those moments, but maybe for the argument of the book and the point we're talking about today, the clearest moment of that was the story of Charles Ball. Charles Ball was an enslaved man. He grew up we're in D.C., just a little bit east of here in Prince George's County, and he was grabbed. He was going about his business one day in 1805, and he was grabbed by a group of white men he did not know. And one of them was a slave trader. He said, "Guess what? You've been sold, and your owner, sent me to, finish the business off." And he was taken down to South Carolina, which was the edge of cotton production at that point. And what he found was that every single day his work was measured, and if he didn't meet up to the quota that had been set for him by the overseer, he was going to be whipped. And then if he didn't, once he actually met that quota consistently, if he didn't meet a new quota, which would be higher, the same thing would happen to him. So over time, the quota was raised. This is how productivity increased. This is how more and more cotton came into the world market, and how profits accrued to every single person, except the person had to figure out how to pick it, who was Charles Ball. And that's the moment when I read that in his memoir. He escaped from slavery, wrote a memoir. That's when I said, wow, this is the secret. This is the secret of how it happened.
And what that led to was not only greater productivity, greater profits. That's what positioned American banks, insurance companies. That's what funded so many other ventures. And the bottom line is, America would not have had the capital to be able to build up its military, which impacted foreign policy, which impacted taking over other territories, if it didn't have the economic resources to do so.
Right. And in fact, the planters were politically very powerful. And so they were constantly pushing the federal government to go into new territories, to acquire new territories. First Louisiana, then Texas, then later New Mexico and California, which they hoped would become cotton territories as well.
What is the reaction you've gotten African Americans have read this, and is it different? There's a different reaction from whites.
It's different. Yeah, it's definitely different. I mean, there are definitely a lot of white readers who read the book and say, thank you for writing the book. I enjoyed engaging with it. But then on the other hand, there's those who have a more defensive reaction. With African American writers, it's more, let's have a conversation about this book. Some of this I knew already. A lot of this I knew already, but it's great to have a conversation about it with a historian who's done all of this archival research to kind of combine with the sort of deeper memory and the deeper understanding of history that's been current, I think, in the African American community.
Well, and the reason I think this is so important is also because this also positions us to understand today, to understand that, to your point, if a Charles Ball didn't have an opportunity to start his own business, to be able to participate in this economic revolution, if he did, what would his family lineage be like? Would they be owners? Would they be able to have businesses? And when essentially labor was constantly stolen. And so whether it's this book, whether it's Douglas Blackman's book, Slavery by Another Name, what we see is that in this country, basically through, I would say, 1970, black labor was absolutely exploited for the economic benefit of the United States.
And there's one more piece of it, too. So Charles Ball actually escapes from slavery and comes back to Maryland, and he settles back into his life here. And he's more or less left alone. His wife is a free African American, and he's sort of able to slip into the community. But later on, after he's worked at a lot of different jobs, works at the Washington Navy Yard and so on, later on, his former owner down in South Carolina figures out where he is and sends the local sheriff to get him. And in fact, what we find is that all over the South, and in fact, a lot of the North, sheriffs and other law enforcement officials were involved in the slave trade, and rounding up runaway slaves and so on. So what
law
we see
enforcement
today,
used.
exactly, this process of containing African American bodies, saying you don't belong here, we're going to move you there, we're going to move you there, we're going to use deadly force if necessary to do it. And that pattern starts in slavery and as a way to defend the system of slavery and make it profitable.
I want all of you, not just adults, but I definitely also want you to have your kids to read this, to understand our history. This is American history, not just black history. This is American history. The book is called The Half Has Never Been Told: Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism by Edward E. Baptist. Edward, I appreciate it. Thank you so very much.
All right. Thanks, Roland.
All right, folks.